This next speaker has spent more than 2 decades in policy, operational and corporate roles in the Australian Department of Defence and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She served as Senior Advisor Major Powers to Australia's Foreign Minister and led trade and investment in the defence and space sectors in Austrade. Would you please welcome the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Rebecca Shrimpton.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be here with you all today. I do, as Tracy noted, come from Planet Defence. Many of you with a security background will know what that means. We tend to lapse into a whole language of acronyms and words that may not mean too much to those who are not accustomed to it. If I do that, please pull me up, put a hand up, throw an empty water cup at me, whatever you need to do. But if I start saying things and it's not clear what I'm referring to or what I mean, please do just let me know. So I think it's a real delight to be able to share with you some thoughts of mine that I've developed certainly over the now 25-ish plus years that I've been working in and around the defence strategy and policy space, foreign policy, trade and investment, and on the Hill as a political advisor. It's been a really interesting time, and a lot has happened. Significant things have happened over those decades. And while it's become a little bit passé, I guess, to say it, and we've often, potentially at risk of overusing this term, I really do believe that we are in unprecedented times. Now that term, we heard a lot around COVID-19 and the pandemic and various things that we all endured around that particular crisis. But from that point on, I really think we've seen the convergence of a number of trends globally and regionally that really should have us in the security space, the national security space, the security space writ large, really quite concerned and focused. As you'll expect with my background, I'm going to be taking more of a national defence and a national security perspective to my remarks. And I want to leave plenty of time for some engagement and some interaction at the end. That said, if you've got a burning question or you want to challenge me on any point throughout, I certainly don't mind, pausing my remarks and having a chat in the middle as well. So please jump in and make this session work for you. I think it's really important that here in Australia that we do acknowledge both as a people and a nation that it is a fact that we face challenges the likes that we have actually never seen before. It can be tempting to draw parallels to previous epochs in history, and of course many people are doing this. It can suggest that we are in times similar in character to pre-1914 or pre-1939, or even pre-major conflict times back into the 1800s. Now, as a student of strategy and policy, there's absolutely nothing wrong with drawing parallels and considering history in this way. Far from it. History should be the constant companion to strategy and certainly to international policy. But what we can't do, and I really caution against, is actually looking to history for precise answers for today's challenges. They're not really going to tell us what we need to know for today. So we need to look at what we can learn. We need to understand what has come before. But we also need to understand and actually have a laser-like focus on what is new and what is different about today's situation. As we look at the strategic environment, even just in the last 2 to 3 years alone, we have seen the unpredicted, until the very last minute, but I would suggest not unpredictable, outbreak of major conventional conflict on the European continent under a nuclear shadow. We've seen an explosive and horrifying reminder of the ongoing threat of terrorism and the ability of non-state actors to disrupt security, stability and society. The capacity for acts like the one that Hamas undertook against Israel on the 7th of October expanded, of course, into a major conflict with humanitarian catastrophe and with the potential to spin into a wider regional or even a global war. These things, once unleashed, are really hard to contain. We've seen dramatic increases in the number of incidents at sea and in the air between Chinese military, maritime militia, fishing fleets, and other foreign navies and coast guards and air forces in and above the South China Sea. This has traditionally been what's called a flashpoint or a hotspot in IR studies and strategic studies, but never has it been this hot. A report that the US DoD prepares for Congress actually captures what they call risky and coercive operational activities targeting foreign aircraft and vessels. And there's been a really alarming uptick. It's truly a hockey curve in the number of these. And just to put a bit of definition or a bit of understanding behind what we mean here, we're talking about lasing, reckless manoeuvres, close approaches in the air or at sea, high rates of closure, discharging chaff or flares in close proximity to aircraft, and even ballistic missile overflights of Taiwan. So to give you an example of the kinds of numbers that we're talking about just between September 2021 and 23, the US documented over 180 instances of People's Liberation Army, Air Force or Navy coercive and risky air intercepts against US aircraft in the region. And over the same period, the PLAN conducted around 100 instances of coercive and risky operational behaviour on sea, a total of 280 instances against the US alone. Another 100 can be added when you include instances that are conducted against US allies and partners. Now, despite the stability agenda of the current government and certainly some diplomatic gains which are important, including some that have lifted economic sanctions against Australian industries and exporters, I am really disappointed to have to say to you today that these military instances, the rate and the number, have not seen the same kind of stabilisation effect. So there is a real demonstrated capacity by China as an actor to pursue an agenda on the diplomatic and the economic front, while it maintains a particular approach in the military domain. And that's something that I think we've not been used to having to deal with. We assume that a relationship, as we get it onto a better footing, improves in all domains. That is not the case. That is not what we are seeing, and that is not what's being reported. You will have noted even just in the last 6 to 9 months, at least 3 incidents, serious incidents, where we could actually have seen loss of life of Australian Defence Force personnel being challenged in waters in which they are operating legally under international law. Now, what worries me is that these numbers can only at some point lead to a mistake or a miscalculation. As they tick up, the risks that are being engaged on an almost daily basis are vast. And I think, in fact, it does beg the question of whether there is a deliberate strategy of pushing boundaries, of pushing red lines, of understanding what it will take, where certain triggers and thresholds for regional actors lie. And this is why the strategy that we have now for our national defence strategy, with deterrence being so central, I think is really important. But what's important about that is that we understand what deterrence means and how to deter, and how those deterrents, how particular actions of ours need to respond to challenges in a way that achieve deterrence. The accumulation of these kinds of behaviours, and it's not just in the South China Sea, we're talking about irregular warfare, grey zone warfare, even land disputes, as we saw between India and China, that broke into an actual loss of life, into an actual conflict. Quite concerning trends here across the board. And again, this accumulation of behaviours is something that we need to take into account as we think about our own strategy and our own responses. Because it is a direct and it's a deliberate challenge to the status quo and to all of the international laws and rules that have underpinned stability and prosperity in this region for most of our nations, small and large alike, for pretty much the period since the end of the World War. Now, this happens, of course, against the backdrop of massive, unmatched anywhere in the world, military modernisation of the People's Liberation Army, all arms. So that's the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Space Force, Rocket Force, and cyber capabilities and information force. It also includes the nuclear force. There's no transparency, there are no assurances, there is no conversation, there is no arms control engagement. Even at the peak of the Cold War, when we saw far greater numbers of nuclear weapons, thank goodness, than we have on the planet today, in a terrifying arms race between the former Soviet Union and the United States, there were mechanisms in which they both could see the dangers, manage the dangers, have conversations about the dangers, and that's probably what got us through that period without a major confrontation. There is no such mechanism, no such conversation, no such engagement, and no willingness for any on the part of the Chinese government at the moment, and that is despite overtures from the Americans consistently to open such talks and to understand what would be required to get that kind of mechanism in place. What we're also seeing is strategic cooperation between actors of concern that have traditionally been perceived to have either interests inimical to one another or to have seen to be quite isolated actors and therefore able to be dealt with as isolated problems. We have a strategic no limits partnership between Russia and China, and alarmingly increasing evidence of Chinese support to the Russian war effort in Ukraine. There's absolutely no doubt about the economic support in terms of buying of gas, etc., but even indirect military support, and in some cases there is some reporting of direct military support. North Korea, in a very rare visit, North Korean leader went and met with President Putin, not unconsequentially at a space launch base, where they struck an agreement for North Korea to provide ammunitions to Russia, which is churning through enormous amounts against the Ukrainians. We should be very concerned about what kind of deal is going on there and how much Russia can offer North Korea in terms of its ballistic missile program and its rocket program and its space program. So the Middle East, of course, is experiencing a period of conflict and instability that was both unexpected and, again, it's proving very difficult to even achieve a pause, an operational pause to address the human tragedy that is amassing around this conflict. What I really think is interesting, and probably more so for all of you today, is that there's been a real trend of a rise in the importance and relevance of the private sector in the national security agenda. What used to be largely government programs and government capabilities developed in government labs, often exquisite capabilities, we've really seen a shift of the locus of innovation and commercial capability with military application to the private sector. And that's providing both some really interesting opportunities, but it's also providing some challenges. Probably the most famous example of this taking place in an operational contemporary context is, of course, Elon Musk's Starlink and the way that supported Ukrainian forces and continues to support Ukrainian forces operating against the Russians. That's a really good example because it shows not only how quickly the private sector moved in and provided a solution for the Ukrainians, and there are many other private companies that I'm not referring to here, some which moved all of the government's record keeping and and systems off sort of national data terrestrial systems and onto a cloud, and actually the business continuity or the governance continuity, even holding on to things like people's national identity, which you can take for granted until you're in the middle of a crisis. Those kinds of things really super important. But what we saw as well in the Starlink example was that while Starlink moved in very quickly and it had an immediate gain, the capacity to withstand cyber attacks to those satellites, this speed at which the Starlink company and the satellites could change algorithms and protect themselves even while under attack. The head of US Space Force and Space Command has come out and said it was just simply eye-watering to him, that capability. So extraordinary, the capacity that lies in the private sector. But the downside of this is that you may have some mercurial characters who are the heads of some of these companies. And there was a moment where there was a threat to withdraw that capability from Ukraine. And that created a real, if it did ultimately get resolved, but that created a real moment of crisis and of wondering how we would deal with that. So one of the questions that we have to continue to keep an eye on. On the domestic front as well, and this is something that I think you've talked about already and should be a consistent theme throughout the conference, is the use of mis and disinformation by malign actors, both state and non-state, including proxies and criminal gangs. Here we're talking, about leveraging technology, not just for criminal gain. They're kind of the easier end of the spectrum to deal with, but for shaping human behaviour, for amplifying misinformation messaging and disinformation messaging. There have been several studies, including some from my own organisation, ASPI, that sort of point to the fact that it's not just the data being stolen and harvested and used that we worry about. It's the way that data is then feeding the AI machine of an actor that has a very different set of values and interests to us and is pushed back into our systems and therefore weaponised and used against our free and open societies. And this is particularly concerning for our young people, for those young minds who are on social media, who are forming their ideas, who are forming their identity, and in some cases are consuming what is called, in some cases, sort of crack for the mind. It's being deliberately pushed out by actors like China. We need to think about data as a commodity. We need to think about how we protect it. We need to understand its value, not just to us. I'm personally someone who thinks, hey, I've got nothing to hide. Why am I worried about, ticking the box? Yes, you can have access. I don't do anything online that I'm ashamed of or that I'm concerned about. But I am concerned about the fact that my data, and serious amounts of it, might actually be going to build a capability with military application in a country that I know does not share my interests and values, and that I know is trying to manipulate some of the debate and some of the information in this country. So protection of data and the way we think about data is something that we really need to consider. And again, this is, really undermining trust in government. And I think this was something that came up earlier as well. It's generative AI, as it comes online and becomes ever more capable, just increases the risks and the impact of this exponentially. The other domestic threat is foreign political interference, economic and industrial espionage. So IP theft of Australian sensitive research and technology. And again, innovators, we have some of the greatest minds and some of the greatest innovators in this country. Some of them are extremely small and they probably aren't, thinking necessarily about the protections that they need for their information, their IP, their data and their capability. But they do need to think about it because ASIO boss Mike Burgess warned earlier this year that journalists, military veterans, judicial figures, all types are being targeted by foreign espionage agencies at, here's that word again, unprecedented levels. He said, and I quote, "Based on what ASIO is seeing, more Australians are being targeted for espionage and foreign interference than at any time in Australia's history. more hostile foreign intelligence services, more spies, more targeting, more harm, more ASIO investigations, more ASIO disruptions. From where I sit, being Mike, it feels like hand-to-hand combat. Add to this the rising cost of living pressures, just a general sense as a society that, we don't have everything we need to look after ourselves, to look after our families, let alone to spend on national defence, to help look after some of these smaller companies, to build those defence capabilities that we are going to need in the future. We have so many competing priorities for a very limited budget. Against that rosy overview of the international and domestic environment, and I'm sorry again, but Defence's job is to think of these worst case scenarios and talk about them and confront them and try and find ways to avoid them happening. But if the worst comes, you have to have some kind of response. So that wasn't a particularly rosy overview, but it's an honest one. You're going to hear a lot more in the next presentation from Dr. Stoltz about sort of what policy responses Australia is bringing to some of these challenges. But I'll just quickly skim really what key characteristics that we're seeing come out of the government in response to this. So we've acknowledged openly, for the first time we did this in the Defence Update in 2020, that we have zero strategic warning time. This is a really, really important concept because previously we had thought it would probably take any adversary that might threaten our interests or present a risk either to the homeland or to our people abroad or in any way to our broader national interests. It would take them between 5 and 10 years to develop the kind of capability that could really threaten us, and that gave us time to respond and build capabilities and invest. That warning time is now officially set to 0. That means we're behind the 8 ball when it comes to investing. That means we cannot put enough ships to sea to deal with potential threats that we now know we may not see coming. We are seeing China do an awful lot of exercises that are positioning around Taiwan. It's normalising a certain amount of activity that might otherwise have been a trigger or what we call a strategic indicator or a warning. There's a lot of complexity in reading the situation, and that demands us to think differently about defence and about defence investment, and again, to think differently about how the commercial sector is engaged and what kind of solutions the commercial sector can bring, because defence cannot solve a lot of these problems alone. We do have, and the National Defence Strategy identified quite clearly, and it called it out, that there is a rising threat posed by China, both in its military capability and its modernisation, as well as its increasingly assertive behaviour. And those two things are important to go together. Capability alone doesn't necessarily mean intent, and behaviours without capability don't necessarily represent a major threat. But when you add up huge amounts of money, huge amounts of modernisation, massive amounts of capability, increasingly assertive behaviour, and huge amounts of money, as well as actual public statements from the government itself around intent, China's role in the world, China's design to have superiority and in fact monopolise certain areas in the future, we really do need to take that very, very seriously. So we need a more muscular and a more capable Australian military, capable of partnering with regional actors, increasingly Japan, Korea, India, Southeast Asian actors, with the US, of course, as Australia's main or only sort of alliance partner with New Zealand. We really do need to think about the collective effort that we can put together to try and provide a good deterrent picture and complicate that calculus of any potential aggressor, plant some seed in there, a seed of doubt in the minds, and hopefully make sure that, it's a not today mindset if they wake up and think, is today the day that we launch some kind of aggressive action? It's been spoken about again that the terror threat level has been raised, and that's a significant development in our society. The government's actual advice on that is really interesting. So I'm just going to quote a little bit from that because I think it sort of supports some of the things I've said a bit earlier. Australia's security landscape, this is from the government website, has entered a vulnerable period and is being challenged by threats with concerning trajectories. Our landscape is a reflection of the social and political environment in which we live. Social cohesion is lower, trust in governments and democratic processes globally are eroding. ASIO is observing the emergence of domestic actors increasingly driven to action by socio-political issues intersecting with personal grievances. There's an increase in extremism fuelled by conspiracy theories and anti-authority ideologues. Some actors hold a blend of ideologies, including those that justify acts of violence to influence change. Social media is a key driver of volatility. The compounding effects of these issues has resulted in a volatile domestic security environment with the potential for an increase in acts of politically motivated violence, including terrorism, to occur across all ideological spectrums. So not calling out any particular ideology there, just saying that we have an increased threat. Just trying to have a look at how we're going for time, and I realise I don't have a... Are we still good if I keep going for a few more minutes, or would we like to go to Q&A? What would you like to do, audience?
I think we might go
to
to
Q&A?
Q&A now because you've
All right.
raised so many important and frankly horrifying issues in your beautiful, calm way. So thank you for keeping us calm despite the content. We do only have a few minutes for questions, so please shoot your hand up or pop a question on the app. While you're thinking about what to ask Beck, I'd like to know how much the situation with China has changed the strategic calculus.
Yeah, I think we collectively there was a hope and an aspiration that when China was rising, we would avoid this thing that we call the Thucydides trap, the rising power, naturally being aggressive and wanting to displace the existing power. By bringing it into international institutions, by bringing China into the WTO, by giving it a really strong stake in the international order. What China has been able to achieve for its citizens as a result of being a participant in that order is extraordinary. And it's not only as a result of, it put a lot of its own domestic policies in place and investments. Nonetheless, there was a genuine hope that would change the flavour and the political character of the nation, and that it would become more democratic. As we look back on those hopes now, I think many of us think, that was a bit naive. And in fact, when you trace some of the strategies for monopoly of industries and critical minerals and EVs, etc., we're going back decades. This is not just a Xi Jinping phenomenon, although he has certainly been very far more sort of public and outspoken about his intent and his dissatisfaction with the status quo. So, in his own words, that revisionism and that desire to revise what the world looks like and how that works for China and China's place in it has become now something that we can't deny. Some people say we're a little bit asleep at the wheel, but all around the world, in Europe, in the US, even in parts of Africa, in South America, increasingly there is a recognition that China is not the actor that we hoped that it would be in the international system, and that we do need to move and act to protect ourselves.
And that speaks to what you mentioned before about China doing one thing and saying another, that dichotomous approach. Yeah. Who would like to ask Beck a question? We have two here. We probably only have time for one, I'm afraid, so maybe whoever you get to first, Brenda. And I do apologise to the other questioner.
Thanks, Beck, for your presentation. Very, very interesting. I'm certainly not condoning any of the wars that are going on. They're horrible, horrible things. But is it not a little hypocritical of us to complain about the partnerships that China and South Korea are making with Russia, for instance, when that's exactly what the America, our allies, have all done with, if you take Ukraine for the example, or Israel. If you were Russian, if we were sitting in Moscow having this conference, for instance, and you were part of the Moscow or the Russian Defence Department, it would be fair to say that you could actually argue quite happily and quite easily the other way around. Why is America, why is Britain supporting Ukraine? So it just seems a little, don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning what they do, but it just seems a little hypocritical to complain about it when it seems to me that we sort of do the same thing.
That's a very fair question, and I think it's important to address that what we are seeing, what you're increasingly is being referred to in the public as an axis of authoritarianism, etc. We, as the West, a US-led system has always operated with partners and allies. Our own goes back to 1951, our formal alliance. We've worked with them for more than 100 years. Yes, that has been the US, it's called it its own superpower, its ability to have friends and allies and partners. It has done that, though, largely out of a sense of common interest and common purpose. There's never been any element of coercion. It's been an attraction. It's been two partners agreeing to come together and do things together because they want to, and particularly post the end of World War II. I think it's fair to say that the evidence suggests that those partnerships were primarily in the interests of peace and stability. They didn't generally, as a net of alliances, create major conflicts. They were the basis for peace and stability. What we're seeing now, and I guess I wouldn't say I'm complaining about it, I'm observing, and I think it's interesting and we need to see it. These are partnerships that are not like alliances and partnerships that we think we know. These are not based necessarily on trust, on closeness, and on interoperability, and they are very much potentially only sort of momentary or temporaneous, because they are very much driven by particular interests. There's significant distrust between China and Russia, between China and North Korea. I mean, these are really interesting relationships. I'm not so much, I would like you to not perceive me to be complaining, I'm observing, and I think it's a really important dynamic. And no, I don't blame them for trying to do that. It's, that's what international relations theory and strategic studies will tell you great powers and powers should do. Nonetheless, what we're seeing is that that's not producing peace. It's not, creating an order around which many other nations are coalescing. Sure, we're seeing an increasing blockism and balance of power kind of competition emerge, but I would suggest that I think one is more benign, perhaps, than the other. That's an observation.
Well, Beck Shrimpton, thank you so much for sharing your research, your insights and your depth of thought on these important global issues. Please put your hands together for Beck.